Montana Territory, 1879. Dust swirled across the open plains as Zachary Whitman crouched behind a weathered oak, rifle steady in his calloused hands. At 25, he'd already seen enough violence to last 3 lifetimes. The setting sun cast long shadows across his angular face, highlighting cheekbones that hadn't yet been weathered by time, though his eyes told a different story. His lean frame, hardened from years in the saddle, tensed as he tracked the movement in the distance. "No man finds peace in these lands," he whispered to himself, a mantra that had kept him alive since his father's ranch had been raided 4 years prior. The frontier's no place for softness, only survival. This belief had served him well as he built his modest ranch from nothing: 20 acres, 34 head of cattle, and a cabin he'd constructed with his own 2 hands. He'd accomplished it all alone, the way he preferred. Neighbors meant complications. Attachments meant vulnerability. In Zachary's experience, the moment you let someone matter to you was the moment you gave fate something to take away. The distant crack of a twig pulled him from his thoughts. What he'd initially mistaken for a deer moved with too much purpose, too much desperation. Zachary narrowed his eyes, focusing through the dying light to make out a figure darting between trees nearly 100 yards away, a woman in a torn blue dress, hair falling loose from what must have been an elegant arrangement hours earlier. Even from this distance, he could see she was running as though the devil himself gave chase. He was about to stand when 3 mounted men emerged from the tree line behind her, their intentions clear in the violent way they spurred their horses forward. Zachary's jaw tightened. Whatever trouble she'd found herself in wasn't his concern. Getting involved meant inviting danger to his doorstep. He had fences to mend, cattle to move before winter. He'd worked too hard to risk everything for a stranger. But when the woman stumbled, when he caught the flash of golden hair in the fading light and heard her desperate cry carry across the distance, something long dormant stirred in his chest. "Damn it all," he muttered, rising to his feet. The sound of gunfire made his decision for him. Delilah Jenkins had never run so hard in her 20 years of life. Her lungs burned with each desperate breath. Her legs threatened to give out beneath her, and the elegant blue dress her fiancé had insisted she wear now hung in tatters around her ankles. Branches whipped at her face as she forced her way through the underbrush, the voices of Edward's men growing louder behind her. "You can't run forever, Miss Jenkins. Mr. Preston wants his bride back." The cruel laughter that followed those words sent renewed terror coursing through her veins. Bride. The very word made bile rise in her throat. Edward Preston was 30 years her senior, a business associate of her late father who had leveraged her father's debts to claim her hand. Her mother, desperate to maintain their standing in Boston society, had agreed to the arrangement without hesitation. "It's what your father would have wanted," she had insisted, pinning Delilah's golden curls into an elaborate style for the engagement dinner. Security, position, a future. What her mother failed to understand was that Edward's calculated smiles masked something sinister. Delilah had discovered it only yesterday, finding ledgers detailing how he had deliberately ruined her father, driving him to an early grave. The marriage wasn't about honoring debts. It was Edward's final triumph over a man he'd hated. When she'd confronted him, his gentle facade had shattered. "Your father was weak," Edward had said, gripping her wrist until she cried out. "But you'll make a fine trophy for my collection. After all, I've paid handsomely for you." She had fled that night, stealing away on the train headed west, using the money from her grandmother's locket to purchase passage. But Edward's reach was long. His men had caught up with her in the small Montana town where she'd disembarked. She'd barely escaped the boarding house before they kicked down her door. Now, with night falling in unfamiliar wilderness, Delilah knew she couldn't outrun horses much longer. A shot rang out, splintering bark near her head. She ducked instinctively, losing her footing on the uneven ground. She tumbled down a short embankment, landing hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. Panic overwhelmed her as she heard hoofbeats approaching. She scrambled to her feet, only to find her path blocked by a fallen tree too large to climb over quickly. She was trapped. "There's nowhere left to run, Miss Jenkins." The leader of Edward's men emerged from the trees, his pistol trained on her. "Mr. Preston is eager to continue your conversation." Delilah backed against the tree trunk, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. I'll die before I marry him. That won't be necessary. The man dismounted, approaching with a cruel smile. Though Mr. Preston did say you might need some persuasion to be reasonable. The crack of a rifle echoed through the forest, and the man's hat flew from his head. He dropped to the ground, cursing. The next one goes through something you'll miss, called a voice from the ridge above them. Delilah looked up to see a young man standing tall against the darkening sky, rifle aimed with unwavering precision. The dying sunlight caught the sharp lines of his face and the determination in his stance. He wasn't particularly large, but something in his posture suggested he was far more dangerous than his youthful appearance might indicate. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," one of the mounted men called. "This woman's engaged to Mr. Edward Preston. We're just returning her to her rightful place." "Seems to me," the cowboy replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut, "that if she's running through the woods with you shooting at her back, she's made her feelings about that rightful place pretty clear." He descended the ridge with the confident movements of someone who knew this land intimately, never lowering his rifle. When he reached Delilah's side, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps no more than 25, with clear blue eyes that assessed the situation with cold efficiency. "3 against 1, boy," the leader said, regaining his composure. "Those aren't odds I'd bet on." The cowboy's expression didn't change. "I don't gamble, but I do own this land you're trespassing on, and in Montana territory, a man's got rights when it comes to protecting what's his." He glanced briefly at Delilah. "Ma'am, I'd appreciate it if you'd step behind me." She did so without hesitation, though her legs trembled beneath her. What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to stretch for eternity. Delilah could feel the cowboy's steady breathing, could sense the absolute confidence with which he held his ground against 3 armed men. "Mr. Preston doesn't take kindly to interference," the leader finally said, his eyes narrowing. "And I don't take kindly to men hunting women through my property," the cowboy replied. "You've got until I count to 5 to turn those horses around. After that, we find out if Mr. Preston pays you enough to die for him." He began counting, his voice never wavering. Delilah held her breath, certain they were both about to be killed. But at 4, the men exchanged glances. Something in the cowboy's demeanor, the absolute certainty in his eyes, perhaps, convinced them he wasn't bluffing. "This ain't over," the leader spat, mounting his horse. "For your sake, I hope it is," the cowboy replied. They watched as the men retreated, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Only when the sound of hoofbeats faded completely did the cowboy lower his rifle. He turned to Delilah, his expression softening just slightly. "Zachary Whitman," he said, offering a brief nod instead of his hand. "My ranch is about a mile west. You'll be safe there tonight." Delilah found her voice at last. "Delilah Jenkins. I thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." Something flickered in his eyes, wariness, perhaps, or resignation. "No need for repayment, Miss Jenkins. But we should move quickly. Night falls fast in these parts, and those men might think better of running once their pride heals a bit." As she followed him through the darkening forest, Delilah couldn't help but notice how he maintained a careful distance between them, how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Here was a man accustomed to solitude, to vigilance, a man who expected the worst from the world. She wondered what had taught him such caution, even as she thanked Providence for placing him in her path when she needed him most. Zachary's cabin stood sturdy against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains, its windows dark and uninviting. He'd built it for function, not comfort, a shelter against the elements and nothing more. As he led the exhausted woman across the threshold, he realized for the first time how Spartan it must appear to outside eyes. A single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table with a single chair. No decorations softened the log walls. No touches of home warmed the space. It was a place to survive, not to live. "It's not much," he said gruffly, lighting the lantern, "but it's dry and warm once the fire gets going." He busied himself with the hearth, aware of her standing uncertainly in the middle of the room, her golden hair falling in tangles around her pale face. The blue dress that clung to her slender frame was badly torn at the hem, and scratches marked her forearms where branches had caught her skin. Despite this, there was a quiet dignity in her posture that impressed him against his will. "You're very kind to shelter me," she said, her voice cultured in a way that immediately marked her as not from these parts. No kindness in it, he replied, perhaps more sharply than intended. Just doing what any decent person would. A lie, and they both knew it. Most decent people would have minded their own business. Getting involved in other folks' troubles was a luxury few could afford on the frontier. Once the fire caught, he rose and moved to a trunk in the corner, retrieving one of his spare shirts and a pair of trousers that would be comically large on her frame. You can change behind that blanket, he said, indicating a wool blanket he sometimes hung to block the draft from the window. I'll wait outside while you get settled. She accepted the clothes with genuine gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Zachary, he corrected automatically, then immediately regretted the familiarity. Attachment was dangerous. She'd be gone tomorrow, and he'd return to the solitary life that had kept him safe these past years. Outside, Zachary leaned against the porch railing and stared up at the emerging stars. He should be checking the cattle, mending the fence in the north pasture, or a dozen other tasks that kept his small ranch functioning. Instead, he'd brought trouble home with him in the form of a woman clearly running from powerful men. When he judged enough time had passed, he knocked on his own door before entering. Delilah sat by the fire, his clothes comically oversized on her slight frame, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her hands. She'd managed to tame her hair into a simple braid, and without the dirt and fear distorting her features, Zachary was struck by how lovely she was. Not just pretty, but beautiful in a way that seemed out of place in the harsh Montana wilderness. I've made us some coffee, he said, gesturing to the pot heating by the fire. And there's jerky and biscuits. Not much of a meal, but it'll keep you going. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. After today, Mr. Whitman, Zachary, I'd consider it a feast. As they ate in awkward silence, he found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. The careful way she held herself, the occasional tremor in her hands that betrayed lingering fear, the distant look in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. Those men, he finally said. They'll be back with more. She set down her cup, nodding slowly. Yes, Edward, Mr. Preston, is not a man who accepts defeat. And he's your fiancé. Zachary kept his voice neutral, though something in him tightened at the confirmation. Against my will, she replied, a flash of defiance cutting through her exhaustion. My father died last year with substantial debts. Mr. Preston offered to forgive them in exchange for my hand. My mother saw no choice but to accept. Zachary considered this. But you ran. I discovered that Edward had deliberately ruined my father's business. Their rivalry went back decades. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. He wanted me as a trophy. Final proof of his victory over my father. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Zachary had encountered many kinds of cruelty in his years on the frontier, but the calculating malice of such an arrangement struck him as particularly vile. The nearest town with a proper sheriff is 2 days' ride, he said finally. When morning comes, I can take you there. You can catch a train further west. California, maybe. She looked up at him, those green eyes holding his gaze steadily. And what of you? These men saw your face. They know where you live. Zachary shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time I've had to handle trouble. Because of me, you may have to handle much more than trouble. Her voice was soft, but direct. Edward Preston has connections throughout the territories. Banks, railroads, mining interests. He's not a man who forgives. Sounds like we have something in common, then, Zachary replied, the corner of his mouth lifting in what might have been the ghost of a smile. He offered her the bed and made himself a pallet by the fire. As he lay awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing across the room, Zachary couldn't shake the feeling that in saving Delilah Jenkins, he'd set in motion events that would shatter the careful isolation he'd built around himself. The frontier had taught him that safety lay in solitude. Connections meant vulnerability. Caring for someone meant giving the world a weapon to use against you. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was of green eyes and quiet courage, and the odd sense that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered existence. Dawn broke over the mountains with a riot of colors that painted the small cabin in hues of gold and amber. Delilah woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a ranch coming to life, the distant lowing of cattle, the whinnying of horses, the creak of a windmill turning in the morning breeze. She sat up slowly, wincing as every muscle protested. Her night on the cowboy's bed, the first real sleep she'd had in days, had revealed just how physically exhausted she was. Zachary was nowhere to be seen, but a pot of coffee sat warming by the banked fire, and beside it lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Curious, she unwrapped it to find a chunk of hard cheese, half a loaf of bread, and an apple that had seen better days but remained edible. A simple breakfast, offered without fuss or expectation of thanks. Like everything else she was learning about Zachary Whitman, it spoke of a man who did what needed doing without seeking recognition. She dressed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pants legs of his borrowed clothes, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sight that greeted her stole her breath. The small ranch sat in a natural bowl of land, surrounded on three sides by rising pine-covered slopes. A creek sparkled in the distance, and beyond it stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed. The mountains rose majestically behind it all, snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning light. It was beautiful in a way that made her heart ache, wild and untamed, yet peaceful. So different from Boston's crowded streets and manicured gardens. She spotted Zachary by the corral, working with a spirited chestnut horse. Even from this distance, she could see the patient way he moved around the animal, speaking in low tones she couldn't make out. The horse, initially skittish, gradually relaxed under his calm attention. As she approached, Delilah was struck again by his youth. In the full light of day, she could see he couldn't be more than 25, his face unlined save for the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against the sun. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. He looked up at her approach, and something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, at seeing her in the morning light, or maybe just the wariness she'd noticed the night before. "Morning," he said, stepping back from the horse. "Hope you found the breakfast." "I did, thank you." She smiled, then gestured toward the horse. "She's beautiful." Zachary corrected. "Name's Tempest. Still getting used to the saddle." He ran a hand along the horse's neck. "But he's got good instincts. Just needs time to learn trust doesn't always end in pain." Something in the way he said it made Delilah wonder if he was really talking about the horse at all. "I've been thinking about your situation," he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "Those men will be back, probably with reinforcements. Preston sounds like the type to hold a grudge." "He is," she confirmed, her stomach tightening at the mere mention of her would-be husband. "I've put you in a terrible position, and I'm truly sorry for it." Zachary shook his head. "You didn't ask those men to chase you through my land, Miss Jenkins." "Delilah," she corrected gently. "If I'm to call you Zachary, then please use my given name." A slight nod acknowledged this. "Delilah, then. The way I see it, you have limited options. Running means always looking over your shoulder, and a woman traveling alone attracts attention. I could find work somewhere," she offered, though even as she said it, she recognized how naive it sounded. What skills did she have that would earn her keep in these harsh lands? "Maybe," he allowed, though his expression suggested he shared her doubts. "But Preston's men would keep searching. Men like that don't give up easily." "What do you suggest?" she asked, realizing that despite having known him less than a day, she valued his assessment more than anyone she'd met since her father's passing. Zachary was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the mountains beyond. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. "I've been thinking we might try another approach. One that gives you protection and might make Preston think twice about pursuing you further." She waited, uncertain what he might be suggesting. "Marriage," he said simply. The word hung between them, startling in its directness. Delilah blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon." A faint color touched his cheekbones, but his gaze remained steady. "Not a real marriage, of course, but a legal one. A married woman has different standing than an unmarried one. Preston's claim on you would be superseded. You would marry me? A complete stranger?" Delilah struggled to comprehend what he was suggesting. "On paper only," he clarified quickly. "You'd have the protection of my name and property rights if anything happened to me. In return, you'd have a safe place to stay until Preston gives up or we find a more permanent solution. When it's safe, we could arrange an annulment." It was such a practical proposal, so devoid of romance or emotion that Delilah almost laughed. Yet beneath the practicality, she recognized an extraordinary offer. This man who valued his solitude above all else was willing to legally bind himself to her, a stranger who had brought danger to his door, simply to keep her safe. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked quietly. Something darkened in his eyes. "I've seen what happens when good people don't stand up to men like Preston. My father tried to mind his own business when the big ranchers started pushing small homesteaders off their land. Thought staying neutral would keep us safe." His jaw tightened. He was wrong. Understanding dawned. "Your family. Gone," he said flatly. "For years ago. I was the only one who survived, and only because I wasn't home when they came." The weight of his loss hung in the air between them. Delilah's heart ached for the young man before her, who had rebuilt his life from ashes and now stood alone against the world. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting more. "So you see, this isn't charity. Preston represents everything I've fought against. Men who believe money and power give them the right to take whatever they want." Delilah considered his offer. A marriage of convenience was hardly what she had dreamed of as a young girl. Yet the alternative, continuing to run, always looking over her shoulder, was far worse. How would we explain my sudden appearance? Surely the town would question a bride appearing from nowhere. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Folks around here mind their own business, mostly. But we could say we met during my cattle drive to Billings last spring. Corresponded since then. It's not unheard of." The plan was audacious, possibly foolish. Yet something about Zachary Whitman inspired confidence. Despite his youth, he possessed a steadiness that made her believe he could face whatever came their way. "If we do this," she said slowly, "you must understand I won't be a burden. I'll work alongside you, earn my keep." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Ranch work isn't like Boston society, Delilah. It's hard, dirty, and unforgiving." She lifted her chin. "I'm stronger than I look, Zachary Whitman. And I learned quickly." For the first time since they'd met, something like genuine amusement crossed his features. "I don't doubt it. But there's time to discuss particulars. For now, the question is, do we have an agreement?" Delilah looked at the hand he extended toward her, calloused, strong, and offered without demand or expectation. She placed her own within it, feeling the careful way his fingers closed around hers. "We have an agreement," she said, and felt the course of her life irrevocably change. The town of Pine Ridge consisted of little more than a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church whose white steeple needed paint, and scattered houses clinging to the hillsides. To Zachary, who avoided it whenever possible, it represented all the complications of human society he preferred to escape. To Delilah, riding beside him in a borrowed dress hastily purchased from the general store, it looked like a haven of civilization after days of wilderness. Judge Harrison, who doubled as the town's only lawyer, regarded them with open curiosity when they entered his office. A portly man with spectacles perched on his nose, he had known Zachary since he was a boy. "Marriage license?" he repeated, setting down his pen. "Well now, that's a surprise. Didn't know you were courting, Zachary." "Been corresponding with Miss Jenkins since spring," Zachary replied, the practice lie coming smoothly. "Met during the cattle drive to Billings." The judge's eyes moved to Delilah, taking in her borrowed dress and the careful way she held herself. "That's so? Well, congratulations to you both. Though I must say, it's unusual to rush things so." Delilah stepped forward, summoning the social grace that had been drilled into her since childhood. "My circumstances have changed recently, Judge Harrison. My mother passed unexpectedly, leaving me without family in Boston. Zachary kindly offered to make our arrangement official sooner rather than later. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her mother had disowned her the moment she fled, making it clear that she would no longer have a daughter if she dishonored the engagement to Preston." The judge's expression softened. "My condolences, Miss Jenkins. Lost my own mother last winter. Hard thing that." The paperwork was mercifully straightforward. As they signed their names, Delilah felt a strange fluttering in her stomach. This was not how she had imagined her wedding day, in a dusty office, wearing a borrowed dress, pledging herself to a man she'd known less than a week. Yet when Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, when Zachary awkwardly took her hand to slide a simple gold band onto her finger, purchased that morning from the town's only jeweler, she felt an unexpected sense of rightness. Not romance, certainly, but something akin to finding solid ground after months of uncertainty. The kiss that sealed their union was brief, the merest brush of lips, Zachary's eyes remaining open and watchful throughout. Yet Delilah felt the gentle pressure of his hand at her waist, steadying her, and thought perhaps there was kindness in this unusual man after all. As they left the judge's office, now legally bound as husband and wife, Zachary leaned close to speak quietly in her ear. "We're being watched. Two men by the saloon. Don't look directly." Delilah's heart stuttered, but she maintained her composure, smiling up at him as though he'd whispered something tender. "Preston's men. Could be. We should finish our business in town quickly." The general store yielded practical necessities, clothing that would actually fit Delilah, sturdy boots to replace her impractical city shoes, basic toiletries. Throughout their shopping, Zachary maintained a hyper-awareness of their surroundings, his body always positioned between her and the street. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, a shadow fell across them. Zachary turned to find Sheriff Mills regarding them with open curiosity. "Heard congratulations are in order," the sheriff said, his weathered face creasing into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mighty quick courtship, Whitman. When you know, Zachary replied evenly. The sheriff's gaze moved to Delilah. "Mrs. Whitman, is it? Interesting timing. Had some fellows in town yesterday, asking after a young lady from back east. Golden hair, green eyes. Said she'd run away from her family." Delilah felt Zachary tense beside her, but his voice remained calm. "My wife has no family left, Sheriff. That's why we married so quickly. Is that right?" The sheriff looked directly at Delilah. "These men seemed mighty concerned about you, ma'am. Said your mother was beside herself with worry." Drawing on years of social training, Delilah smiled pleasantly. "I'm afraid they're mistaken, Sheriff. My mother passed away recently, which is why I came west to join my husband. Perhaps they're searching for someone else." The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "Perhaps. Still, odd coincidence." He tipped his hat. "Well, congratulations on your nuptials. Hope you'll be happy out at that lonely ranch, Mrs. Whitman. Can get mighty isolated up there." The warning in his words was unmistakable. As the sheriff walked away, Delilah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We need to leave," Zachary murmured. Now, the ride back to the ranch was tense, both of them scanning the trail for signs of pursuit. Only when the cabin came into view did Zachary's shoulders relax slightly. "The sheriff didn't believe us," Delilah said as he helped her down from the wagon. "No," Zachary agreed. "But he didn't stop us either. That counts for something." As they unloaded their purchases, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were legally married, bound together by law, if not by choice. They would share this small cabin, this isolated life, for the foreseeable future. "I'll sleep by the fire," Zachary said, as though reading her thoughts. "Nothing changes except on paper." Delilah nodded, grateful for his understanding, yet strangely disappointed by his matter-of-fact tone. She told herself it was ridiculous to feel anything but relief at his respectful distance. This was a practical arrangement, nothing more. Yet as evening fell and they moved around each other in the small cabin, Zachary tending the fire while she prepared a simple meal from their stores, Delilah couldn't help but notice how naturally they settled into a rhythm together. There was something oddly intimate about sharing this space, about the domestic quiet that descended as they ate by lantern light. "Tell me about your life before," she said, breaking the silence. "You mentioned your family, but not much else." Zachary looked up from his plate, surprise evident in his expression. Perhaps no one had asked about his past in a long time. "Not much to tell," he said after a moment. "My father brought us west when I was 14. Built this ranch from nothing. Taught me everything I know about cattle, horses, surviving out here." A shadow crossed his face. He was a good man. Too good for this place, maybe. "And your mother?" A softer expression now. "Kind. Strong in her own way. She made this cabin feel like home, even when winter stretched for months and food ran short." He hesitated, then added, "She used to sing while she worked. Haven't heard music here since she died." The simple admission touched something in Delilah's heart. She thought of this young man alone for 4 years, working this land without the comfort of family or song. "My father used to read to me," she offered in return. "Every night, no matter how tired he was from work." Said stories were more valuable than gold because they lived in you forever. Zachary's expression softened. Sounds like a good father. He was. Delilah smiled sadly. He would have hated what Edward did to him. Not the financial ruin. Father never cared much for money, but the manipulation. The lies. Father valued honesty above all else. Like daughter, like father, Zachary observed quietly. The compliment, unexpected and sincere, warmed her more than the fire. They continued talking as the evening deepened, sharing pieces of themselves, small truths that gradually formed a bridge between them. Later, as Delilah lay in the bed while Zachary settled by the fire, she found herself studying his profile in the dying light. This strange, solemn young man who had married her to save her from harm, who maintained his careful distance even as he offered protection. "Zachary," she whispered. He turned, propped on one elbow. "Yes. Thank you. Not just for today, but for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there in the forest." In the firelight, she saw the barest hint of a smile touch his lips. "Get some sleep, Delilah. Tomorrow comes early on a ranch." As she drifted off, Delilah realized that for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. Protected. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but one she could grow accustomed to. What she couldn't have articulated, even to herself, was the seed of something else taking root alongside that sense of safety. Something she wasn't yet ready to name. The following weeks settled into an unexpected rhythm. True to her word, Delilah threw herself into ranch work with determination that surprised even Zachary. She rose before dawn without complaint, learned to collect eggs without frightening the hens, and gradually mastered the art of building a fire that wouldn't smoke them out of the cabin. Her first attempts at cooking resulted in biscuits hard enough to serve as doorstops, but by the third week, she could produce a meal that was not only edible but satisfying. Her hands, once soft from city living, developed calluses. Her skin tanned from hours in the sun. The borrowed dresses gave way to practical skirts and blouses that allowed her to move freely as she worked. For his part, Zachary found himself gradually adjusting to her presence. The cabin, once a place of austere utility, began to transform under her touch. Wildflowers appeared in a jar on the table. The single chair became two, salvaged from the storage shed and repaired. Curtains fashioned from fabric remnants softened the harsh light through the windows. Most surprising was how quickly he grew accustomed to her voice, filling the silence he had lived with for so long. Delilah spoke as she worked. Observations about the changing weather, memories of her childhood, questions about ranch life that he found himself answering with increasing detail. Sometimes she hummed or sang softly, old ballads and hymns that made him think of his mother. They developed an easy division of labor, with Zachary handling the cattle and heavier work while Delilah managed the garden, chickens, and household tasks. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Zachary repairing tack or cleaning his rifle, while Delilah mended clothing or read from one of the few books they owned. It was during these quiet moments that Zachary found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. The graceful curve of her neck as she bent over her work, the way firelight caught in her golden hair, the small furrow that appeared between her brows when she concentrated. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her resilience that impressed him most. The quiet strength with which she faced each new challenge. One evening, nearly a month after their hasty marriage, Zachary returned from checking the herd to find Delilah standing on a chair in the cabin, attempting to hang something on the wall. "What are you doing?" he asked, startling her enough that she wobbled precariously. He moved quickly, steadying the chair with one hand while the other caught her waist to keep her from falling. The contact was brief but electric, his palm registering the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her blouse. He withdrew his hand as soon as she was stable, a strange heat rising in his face. "Sorry," she said, stepping down from the chair. "I wanted to surprise you." On the wall hung a simple frame containing a detailed pencil drawing of the cabin with the mountains rising behind it. The skill evident in the work took him by surprise. "You drew this?" Delilah nodded, a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "Do you like it?" "I found some paper in town and thought." Well, the walls seemed bare. Zachary studied the drawing more closely. She had captured not just the structure but something of its spirit. The solidity of the logs, the way morning light slanted across the porch, the sense of the cabin standing firm against the wilderness. It's good, he said, the words inadequate to express his genuine admiration. I didn't know you could draw like this. My mother insisted on proper accomplishments for a lady, she explained with a small smile. Drawing, music, embroidery. I always preferred drawing. It was the one lesson I actually looked forward to. You have real talent. Zachary touched the frame lightly. Thank you. The genuine pleasure in his voice brought a flush to her cheeks. It's nothing, really. Just a way to pass the time. But they both knew it was more than that. It was the first personal mark she had made on his home. No, their home, at least for now. A declaration that she was not merely passing through, but living here, with him. That night, as they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them, Zachary found himself speaking of things he had kept buried for years. I was in Billings when they came, he said, his voice low. Delivering a message for my father. Should have been a quick trip, there and back in 2 days. Delilah set aside her mending, sensing the importance of what he was sharing. A storm delayed me. Bad one, lightning striking all around. By the time I made it back, his jaw tightened. The ranch had been burned. My parents, my little sister Emma, they were all gone. The neighboring rancher, Jensen, had been trying to buy our water rights for months. Father refused to sell. Zachary, Delilah whispered, her heart aching for the young man who had returned to find his world destroyed. I rebuilt, he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. Different spot, further from the main road. Started over with the few cattle that had scattered. Worked Jensen's ranch at night to earn money for supplies, then my own land during the day. A grim smile. Didn't sleep much that first year. And Jensen? The man who, she couldn't finish the question. Dead. The word fell between them like a stone. Found him a year later, drunk in a ravine with his horse standing over him. Looked like he'd fallen, broken his neck. Zachary's eyes met hers, unflinching. I didn't push him, if that's what you're wondering. But I can't say I mourned him either. Delilah reached across the space between them, her fingers lightly touching his hand. I'm sorry for what you lost, for what was taken from you. He looked down at her hand on his, seemingly unsure how to respond to the gesture of comfort. After a moment, he turned his palm upward, briefly clasping her fingers in his own before releasing them. That's why I live out here, he said. Away from people. Complications. When you keep to yourself, you don't have to worry about losing anything. The philosophy broke Delilah's heart even as she understood it. He had rebuilt his life through sheer force of will, protecting himself from further loss by refusing to form new attachments. Yet here she was, living in his home, sharing his name, gradually becoming part of a life he had carefully designed to exclude others. Does it get lonely? She asked softly. He considered this, as though the question had never occurred to him before. Used to it, I suppose. Haven't thought about it much. But the slight furrow of his brow suggested otherwise. Perhaps her presence had awakened awareness of the solitude he had embraced for so long. As they prepared for sleep, Delilah taking the bed while Zachary made his pallet by the fire, as had become their custom, she found herself wondering what it would take to breach the walls this young man had built around himself. Whether anyone could. Whether she wanted to. The first real test of their arrangement came 6 weeks after their marriage, with the arrival of 3 riders at dusk. Zachary spotted them from the corral, where he was working with Tempest. Something in the purposeful way they approached set his instincts on edge. Delilah, he called, keeping his voice even. Go inside, please. She looked up from the garden, following his gaze to the approaching riders. Understanding immediately, she set down her basket and moved quickly toward the cabin. Zachary unsaddled Tempest and turned him loose in the corral, then retrieved his rifle from where it rested against the fence. Not overtly threatening, but visible. A statement. As the riders drew closer, he recognized the lead man, one of Preston's thugs from the forest confrontation. The other 2 were strangers, but their hard expressions and the way they carried themselves told Zachary everything he needed to know. Afternoon, he said coolly as they reined in their horses. You're a long way from anywhere. Mr. Whitman, the leader acknowledged with a nod that held no respect. We've come on behalf of Mr. Edward Preston regarding his fiancée, Miss Delilah Jenkins. No one here by that name, Zachary replied. My wife's name is Delilah Whitman. A thin smile spread across the man's face. Yes, we heard about your hasty nuptials. Mr. Preston finds the timing curious, considering Miss Jenkins, pardon, Mrs. Whitman, was engaged to him merely weeks ago. My wife's personal history is none of your concern, Zachary said, shifting his rifle slightly. Nor is it Mr. Preston's. Mr. Preston disagrees. The man produced an envelope from his jacket. He's authorized me to offer compensation for your inconvenience. $5,000, in exchange for annulling this marriage of convenience and returning Miss Jenkins to her rightful place. The sum was staggering, more money than Zachary had seen in his entire life. Enough to expand the ranch, buy better breeding stock, secure his future for years to come. For a brief, shameful moment, he felt the temptation of it. Then he thought of Delilah, her quiet determination, her growing confidence, the way she had begun to smile more freely as the weeks passed. The fear in her eyes when she spoke of Preston. Not interested, he said flatly. The man's expression hardened. Mr. Preston is being generous. He understands you may have developed attachments, but he assures me this offer will not be repeated. Tell Preston his assurances mean nothing to me. My wife isn't for sale. Zachary took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Now get off my land before I forget my hospitality. The standoff stretched for several tense heartbeats. Then the leader nodded, tucking the envelope away. Mr. Preston will be disappointed, he said. He's not a man who takes disappointment well. Neither am I, Zachary replied. As the riders departed, Zachary remained motionless until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he lower his rifle and turn toward the cabin. Delilah stood in the doorway, her face pale. She had clearly overheard the exchange. They offered you money, she said as he approached. $5,000. They did. That's a fortune. Zachary shrugged. Not enough. Her eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of resentment or calculation. Finding none, she asked the question that had been growing between them for weeks. Why are you doing this, Zachary? Truly? You've put yourself at risk, turned down a small fortune, all for someone you barely knew a month ago. He considered her question, finding himself unexpectedly reluctant to hide behind vague principles or duty. Perhaps it was time for honesty, even if the truth was still taking shape in his own mind. When I found you in those woods, he said slowly, you were running for your life, but you weren't beaten. There was a fierceness to you, a refusal to surrender. He looked down, suddenly uncomfortable with his own words. Reminded me that maybe there are things worth fighting for, even in a world that takes more than it gives. The simple admission hung in the air between them. Delilah stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, the slight tremble of her lips. I was so afraid, she whispered, until you appeared, like some avenging angel with a rifle. A reluctant smile touched his lips. Not much of an angel. No, she agreed, her own smile matching his. Something better. Something real. Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his cheek. A gesture of gratitude, and something more, something neither of them was ready to name. Thank you, she said softly, then turned and walked back into the cabin. Zachary remained on the porch for a long time afterward, his hand unconsciously rising to touch the spot where her lips had been. Something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed that could not be uncrossed. And for the first time in years, the prospect of connection did not fill him with dread. Summer yielded to autumn, painting the mountains in fiery hues and bringing cooler nights that encouraged closer quarters by the fire. The practical marriage of convenience had evolved into something neither Zachary nor Delilah had anticipated, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. They still maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, but the careful distance Zachary had initially insisted upon had gradually diminished. Their hands might touch when passing tools or dishes, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Conversations stretched later into the evening, revealing more of themselves to each other with each passing night. Delilah had continued to transform the cabin with small touches, curtains for the windows, a braided rug beside the bed, wildflowers arranged in mason jars until frost claimed the last blooms. Her drawings now adorned several walls, landscapes of the ranch, a portrait of Tempest, even a sketch of Zachary that she had completed secretly while he repaired fencing. For his part, Zachary found himself making changes of his own. He built a proper bookshelf after noticing how carefully Delilah treated their few volumes. When a traveling peddler passed through, He traded a side of beef for fabric and sewing supplies without being asked. Most tellingly, he began bringing home small gifts from his infrequent trips to town: hair ribbons, a jar of honey, once even a small bottle of lavender scent that reminded him of the soap his mother had made. They settled into the rhythm of ranch life together, with Delilah proving more capable than either had expected. She learned to milk the cow Zachary purchased, mastered the art of bread making after numerous failed attempts, and even developed a quiet understanding with Tempest, who allowed her to stroke his nose when he would tolerate no one else save Zachary. The threat of Preston remained, but as weeks passed without incident, they allowed themselves to hope that perhaps he had moved on to other pursuits. This cautious optimism lasted until the first snowfall of the season, when Sheriff Mills arrived at their door, his expression grim beneath the brim of his snow-dusted hat. "Whitman," he nodded as Zachary invited him in. "Mrs. Whitman." Delilah offered coffee, which the sheriff accepted gratefully, warming his hands around the cup as he settled at their table. "What brings you out in this weather, Sheriff?" Zachary asked, though something in the man's demeanor suggested he already knew. "Wish it was just a social call," Mills replied. "Got word from back east. That fella Preston? He's filed formal charges against you, Mrs. Whitman. Claims you stole family heirlooms before you left." Delilah paled. "That's absurd. I took nothing but the clothes on my back and my grandmother's locket." The sheriff shrugged. "Maybe absurd, but it's legal trouble nonetheless. He's hired attorneys in 3 territories. They're pushing for extradition." "Extradition?" Zachary's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're saying they want to take my wife back east to face false charges?" "That's the shape of it," Mills confirmed. "Now, I know something ain't right about this situation. Girl runs away, marries a stranger. Now her fiancé wants her back badly enough to fabricate theft charges." He gave them a pointed look. "But the law's the law, and I'm bound by it." "So you've come to arrest me," Delilah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Not today." The sheriff set down his cup. "Paperwork hasn't reached me officially yet. Probably won't for another week, given the weather." He looked directly at Zachary. "Thought you ought to know what's coming, is all." The warning was clear. Mills might not approve of Preston's tactics, but he would enforce the law when required. After the sheriff departed, Zachary and Delilah sat in stunned silence, the implications settling between them like the snow accumulating outside. "I'll have to go," Delilah finally said. "If I stay, they'll arrest me, and you'll be implicated as well. Harboring a fugitive." "No." The word was firm, brooking no argument. "We're not surrendering to false charges. What choice do we have? Preston has money, influence, lawyers. We can't fight that." Zachary rose, pacing the small confines of the cabin. "We leave. Head west, into Idaho territory. Or north to Canada. Somewhere beyond Preston's reach. Run? In winter?" Delilah gestured toward the window, where snow was falling more heavily. "That's suicide, Zachary. And even if we survived, what then? Always looking over our shoulders, never settling anywhere? That's not a life. And returning to Preston is?" His voice rose with rare emotion. "Delilah, he'll destroy you. One way or another." She stood, moving to place her hands on his arms, steadying his agitation. "I know, but there has to be another way. Something we're not seeing." Zachary looked down at her, at the determined set of her jaw and the unwavering courage in her eyes. This woman who had fled one prison only to find herself facing another, who had worked alongside him without complaint for months, transforming not just his cabin, but his entire conception of what his life could be. In that moment, he realized the depth of what he felt for her, not just admiration or protectiveness, but something far more profound, something he had thought himself incapable of feeling again after losing his family. "There is another way," he said quietly, "but it's dangerous. For both of us." The plan came together over the following days, as snow continued to blanket the countryside. Zachary rode to neighboring ranches, calling in favors and making arrangements. Delilah packed essentials, prepared food that would travel well, and spent hours poring over maps spread across their table. Their strategy was audacious, perhaps foolhardy. Rather than fleeing or surrendering, they would confront Preston's machinations directly by traveling east to Boston. "He's vulnerable there," Zachary had reasoned. "It's where his reputation matters most, where witnesses to his dealings with your father might still be found. If we can prove he deliberately ruined my father, Delilah added, it undermines his claim against me. Shows a pattern of deception. They would travel as husband and wife, which they were, legally if not yet in all ways, gathering evidence of Preston's manipulations along the railroad route east. Delilah knew which banks had handled her father's accounts, which business associates might still harbor resentments against Preston. It was a desperate gamble, but preferable to the alternatives. The night before their departure, as they made final preparations, a knock at the door froze them both. Zachary motioned for Delilah to move out of sight, then approached cautiously, rifle in hand. "Who's there?" he called. "Mills," came the reply. "Alone." Zachary opened the door to find the sheriff stamping snow from his boots. The man looked exhausted, his face lined with more than just the cold. "Extradition papers arrived early," he said without preamble. "Train from the territorial capital got through despite the weather. I'm supposed to bring Mrs. Whitman in tomorrow morning." Delilah stepped into view, her face pale but composed. "I see." The sheriff glanced between them, taking in the packed bags visible on the table. "Looks like you were planning to be elsewhere." "Sheriff," Zachary began, but Mills raised a hand. "Don't much care for the details," he interrupted. "Just came to tell you I'll be here at noon tomorrow." Not a minute before. His gaze lingered meaningfully on their preparations. Understanding dawned. The sheriff was giving them time to leave. Not much, but enough if they moved quickly. "Noon," Zachary repeated. "We appreciate the notice, Sheriff." Mills nodded once, then turned to go. At the door he paused. "Weather report says another storm's coming in from the north. Roads east might be impassable by morning. Real shame that." With that cryptic remark, he departed, leaving them staring at each other in the sudden silence. "He's helping us," Delilah whispered, disbelieving. "Helping us get a head start, at least," Zachary corrected, already moving to gather their bags. "But he's still bound to follow if we don't cover our tracks well." They worked through the night, loading provisions onto the sturdy wagon Zachary had prepared. 2 good horses would pull it, with Tempest trailing behind. The plan had been to leave at first light, but Mills's warning accelerated their timeline. By midnight, they were ready. The cabin stood silent around them, the fire burned down to embers. Delilah paused in the doorway, looking back at the space that had become her first real home since her father's death. "We'll come back," Zachary said softly, reading her thoughts. "When this is finished." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This small cabin represented so much: safety, partnership, the gradual awakening of feelings she had thought herself too practical to indulge. To leave it felt like tempting fate. Outside, snow was falling again, thick flakes that would cover their tracks but make travel treacherous. Zachary helped her onto the wagon seat, then covered her with blankets before taking the reins. "Ready?" he asked, his breath fogging in the cold air. Delilah looked at him, at the young man who had transformed from reluctant rescuer to steadfast partner, who had married her for protection but was now risking everything to keep her safe. "Ready," she confirmed, and slipped her gloved hand into his. As they pulled away from the cabin, following the little-used trail that would take them north before cutting east, Delilah found herself thinking not of the dangers ahead, but of the promise in that simple touch. The possibility that when this was over, they might return to build something real from the foundation they had laid. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a life together. The journey east proved every bit as challenging as they had anticipated. Winter travel was slow and dangerous, with snow-blocked passes and ice-choked rivers testing their resolve at every turn. They followed secondary routes, avoiding main rail lines where Preston's men might be watching. 2 weeks into their journey, as they sheltered in a small Wyoming town during a particularly fierce blizzard, Zachary returned to their rented room with a newspaper that chilled them more thoroughly than the howling wind outside. "Rancher's wife abducted," the headline proclaimed. Below it, an article detailed how the notorious outlaw Zachary Whitman had allegedly forced Delilah Jenkins, described as the daughter of a prominent Boston businessman, into a fraudulent marriage before kidnapping her when authorities attempted to restore her to her rightful family. "He's painted you as a criminal," Delilah whispered, scanning the article with growing horror. "And me as your victim." Zachary's expression was grim. "Changes things. Now every lawman between here and Boston will be looking for us." They altered their plans accordingly. Delilah cut her distinctive golden hair short, and dyed it brown using walnut hulls purchased from a local apothecary. Zachary grew a beard and exchanged his distinctive hat for a city-style bowler that made him look like an Eastern businessman rather than a rancher. They traveled as Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Williams, investors researching opportunities in the expanding Western territories. The disguise served them well, allowing them to move through towns without arousing suspicion. Delilah's natural social grace and Zachary's quiet attentiveness made them appear to be exactly what they claimed, a respectable married couple on legitimate business. As they progressed eastward, they gathered information methodically. In Omaha, they located a former business partner of Delilah's father who confirmed that Preston had systematically undermined Jenkins' imports by spreading rumors of insolvency, causing creditors to call and loan simultaneously. In Chicago, they discovered bank records showing how Preston had purchased those same debts at a fraction of their value, giving him leverage over the failing company. Each piece of evidence strengthened their case, but also increased the danger. Preston's network was extensive, his influence reaching far beyond what they had anticipated. Twice they narrowly avoided men who matched the description of his hired thugs. Once, they were forced to flee a hotel in the middle of the night when the clerk recognized Delilah despite her altered appearance. Through it all, the nature of their relationship continued to evolve. The forced proximity of travel, the shared dangers and triumphs, the quiet moments in rented rooms where they planned their next moves, all served to deepen the connection between them. One night, as a late spring storm lashed the windows of their lodgings in Cleveland, Delilah found herself studying Zachary as he reviewed their notes by lamplight. The beard suited him, she decided, lending maturity to his youthful features. More striking was the change in his demeanor. The guarded isolation that had defined him when they met had given way to a quiet confidence. He still maintained his watchfulness, but it now extended to protecting her rather than simply defending himself from the world. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her gaze. "That you're different from the man I met in the forest," she replied honestly. "Less alone." He considered this, setting aside the papers. "I was alone for so long. I forgot there was another way to be." His eyes met hers. "You reminded me." The simple admission touched her deeply. "I think perhaps we reminded each other." Zachary nodded, then said quietly, "You know, when this is over, when Preston can no longer threaten you, you'll be free to choose your own path. Our arrangement was always meant to be temporary." The statement hung between them, ostensibly offering freedom, but containing a question neither had been brave enough to ask directly. Delilah moved from her chair to sit beside him on the small sofa. "And if I've already chosen my path?" His eyes searched hers, hope warring with the caution that had protected him for so long. "Delilah." She placed her hand on his, halting his words. "When I ran from Edward, I was running towards something unknown. Freedom, perhaps, or at least the chance to determine my own fate." She smiled softly. "I never expected to find a partner. Someone who sees me as an equal, not a possession." "You are my equal," he said, his voice low and fervent. "In every way that matters." "Then let me speak plainly. Our marriage began as a matter of convenience and protection. But what I feel for you now has nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with choice." She took a deep breath. "I choose you, Zachary Whitman, not because you saved me, but because of who you are, who we are together." For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, overwhelmed by her declaration. Then, with a tenderness that belied his strength, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. "I thought I'd never let myself care for anyone again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Too dangerous. Too much to lose. But you." He shook his head, searching for words. "You made me remember what it means to be alive. Not just surviving, but living." Their lips met in a kiss unlike the brief, ceremonial one that had sealed their legal union. This was a covenant of choice, of recognition, of love acknowledged and embraced after months of cautious growth. When they parted, Delilah rested her forehead against his, savoring the closeness she had yearned for but never demanded. "Whatever comes in Boston," she whispered, "we face it together. As true partners." Zachary's arms tightened around her, his reply a vow more binding than any legal document. Together. That night, the distinction between marriage of convenience and marriage of choice dissolved completely. When morning came, They rose not as allies in a strategic arrangement, but as husband and wife in every sense, bound by choice, by trust, and by a love neither had been looking for, but both had found. Boston in early summer was a far cry from the Montana wilderness. Elegant carriages traversed cobblestone streets, ladies in fine dresses promenade through manicured parks, and the air hummed with commerce and society gossip. To Zachary, who had never traveled east of Chicago, it was a foreign country with customs and codes he could barely decipher. Delilah, however, moved through her former world with the confidence of a native, guiding them through the complexities of Boston society. They had taken rooms in a modest hotel under their assumed names, carefully avoiding the neighborhoods where Delilah might be recognized despite her altered appearance. Their plan was methodical. First, gather the final evidence they needed from her father's former attorney. Then, use that evidence to approach the editor of the Boston Herald, a newspaper known for its investigative reporting on business improprieties. With Preston's machinations exposed publicly, his false charges against Delilah would lose credibility. The risk was enormous. If Preston discovered their presence before they could act, he would use every resource at his disposal to silence them. The altered headline of Zachary as kidnapper gave Preston legal justification for having him arrested, or worse. 2 days after their arrival, they achieved their first objective. Delilah's father's attorney, Mr. Harrington, received them in his office after hours, his initial skepticism giving way to outrage as they presented the evidence they had gathered during their journey east. "This is most disturbing," the elderly lawyer said, examining the documents spread across his desk. "I always had reservations about Mr. Preston's sudden interest in acquiring your father's debts, but this goes beyond sharp business practices into outright fraud. Can you help us prove it?" Zachary asked. Harrington nodded slowly. "I believe so. Your father entrusted me with certain documents, contingency plans, he called them. Said if anything happened to him, I was to examine them carefully." He rose, moving to a wall safe concealed behind a painting. "I did so after his death, but found nothing immediately actionable. In light of what you've shown me, however, the documents he produced were damning. Letters from Preston to various creditors, encouraging them to call in Jenkins' debts simultaneously. Notes detailing inside information that could only have been obtained through industrial espionage. Most significantly, a draft contract showing Preston's intention to absorb Jenkins' imports at a fraction of its value once its founder was ruined." "My God," Delilah whispered, tears filling her eyes as she read her father's meticulous notes documenting his suspicions. He knew what Edward was doing, but couldn't prove it in time. Harrington's expression was grave. "With what you've brought me, combined with these documents, we have more than enough to launch both civil and criminal proceedings against Preston. The difficulty will be acting quickly enough to prevent him from using his influence to suppress the matter. That's why we need the newspaper," Zachary explained. "Once the story is public, he loses the advantage of secrecy." The attorney agreed to arrange a meeting with the Herald's editor the following day. As they prepared to leave, he regarded Zachary with newfound respect. "Mrs. Jenkins, pardon me, Mrs. Whitman, always spoke of her daughter's strong will. I see she has found a partner equally determined." Zachary accepted the compliment with a slight nod. "I'm fortunate that she chose to share her strength with me." Outside, as they made their way back toward their hotel through the gathering dusk, Delilah slipped her arm through his. "You impressed him, you know. Harrington doesn't offer praise lightly." Zachary gave a self-deprecating smile. "Just a Montana rancher trying to navigate your world without stepping on too many toes." "Our world," she corrected gently. "And you're doing far better than you think." They walked in companionable silence for several blocks, the evening air mild after the stifling heat of the day. It was only as they turned onto the street leading to their hotel that Zachary sensed something amiss. His stride faltered, causing Delilah to look up questioningly. "What's wrong?" "Not sure," he murmured, scanning the street ahead. "Something doesn't feel right." Years of frontier vigilance had honed his instincts for danger. Now those same instincts were screaming a warning he couldn't articulate but wouldn't ignore. He guided Delilah into the shadow of a nearby building, his eyes continuing to search the darkening street. There, a carriage parked across from their hotel, its lamps unlit but a driver visible on the box. 2 men loitering near the hotel entrance, their posture too alert for casual pedestrians. Another figure in the alley beside the building. Preston's men, he said quietly. They found us. Delilah's grip on his arm tightened, but her voice remained steady. How? We've been so careful. Someone at the hotel, perhaps. Or we were followed from Harrington's office. Zachary's mind raced through their options. We can't go back there. They'll be watching all night. The documents, Delilah whispered. Everything we've gathered. It's all in our room. A bitter setback, but not catastrophic. Harrington has copies of the most important evidence now. We need to find somewhere safe to spend the night, then contact him in the morning. But where? They knew no one else in Boston trustworthy enough to shelter them. Hotels would require identification, potentially alerting Preston to their new location. As they debated their options in hushed tones, a voice spoke from behind them. Delilah? Is that you? They turned to find an elegantly dressed woman regarding them with undisguised shock. Despite Delilah's altered appearance, recognition was clear in the woman's expression. Mrs. Crawford, Delilah acknowledged, her posture stiffening. The woman had been a friend of her mother's, a pillar of Boston society whose approval had been courted assiduously by the Jenkins family. My dear girl, everyone believes you've been abducted. Your mother has been beside herself with worry. And Mr. Preston, Mrs. Crawford's gaze shifted to Zachary, suspicion replacing surprise. Who is this man? Delilah's hand found Zachary's, holding tightly. Mrs. Crawford, I wasn't abducted. I fled. This is my husband, Zachary Whitman. The older woman's eyes widened. Husband? But the newspapers said, the newspapers printed what Edward Preston wanted them to print, Delilah interrupted firmly. The truth is quite different. And we're in danger now, Mrs. Crawford. Edward's men are watching our hotel. If they find us, I fear what might happen. Mrs. Crawford glanced toward the hotel, then back at the young couple before her. Something in Delilah's steadfast manner, or perhaps in the protective way Zachary stood beside her, seemed to sway the older woman's judgment. Come with me, she said decisively. My carriage is just around the corner. Whatever the truth may be, I won't see Henrietta Jenkins' daughter left without shelter. It was a risk trusting this woman from Delilah's past, but one they had little choice but to take. Mrs. Crawford's townhouse proved to be a grand affair in one of Boston's most fashionable neighborhoods, far from the modest hotel they had chosen. No one will look for you here, Mrs. Crawford assured them as a maid showed them to a guest room. Now, perhaps you might explain exactly what is happening. Over tea served in a sumptuously appointed sitting room, they related their story, from Edward's manipulation of Jenkins' imports to Delilah's flight west, from their meeting in the Montana forest to their journey back east to clear her name. Mrs. Crawford listened attentively, her initial skepticism giving way to outrage as the tale unfolded. That despicable man, she declared when they finished. I never trusted him, though your mother was quite taken with his position and wealth. To think he would go to such lengths. You believe us, then? Delilah asked cautiously. Mrs. Crawford's expression softened. My dear, I've known you since you were in leading strings. Headstrong, yes, but never dishonest. And the way you look at this young man, her gaze shifted to Zachary, speaks volumes about the true nature of your marriage, whatever its origins. Relief washed over Delilah's features. Then you'll help us? We need to contact Mr. Harrington in the morning without alerting Preston's men. Of course I'll help, Mrs. Crawford declared. Edward Preston may have influence in certain circles, but he'll find the Crawford name opens doors he cannot close. Now, you must both be exhausted. We'll continue this discussion in the morning. As they were shown to their room, a single chamber, Mrs. Crawford having accepted without question that they were truly husband and wife, Zachary marveled at the unexpected alliance they had formed. Your Boston society is full of surprises, he murmured as they prepared for bed. Delilah smiled, the tension of the day finally easing from her shoulders. Mrs. Crawford was always kind to me, even when my mother found me disappointing. I'm glad her independence of mind hasn't changed. They slept that night in a four-poster bed draped with silk hangings, a far cry from the rustic cabin in Montana or the modest lodgings of their journey. Yet as they held each other in the darkness, both found themselves longing for the simplicity of the home they had begun to build together. When this is over, Zachary whispered against Delilah's hair, we're going home. She nestled closer, her reply both promise and prayer. Home. The confrontation, when it came, was neither in a courtroom nor a newspaper office as they had planned. Rather, it unfolded in the unlikely setting of Mrs. Crawford's drawing room, where Boston's elite had gathered for an afternoon musical recital. The invitation had been Mrs. Crawford's idea. "Preston never misses these gatherings," she had explained. "It's where the real business of Boston is conducted, between musical numbers and champagne. If you want to face him with witnesses who matter, this is your opportunity." The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. With Boston's most influential citizens as witnesses, Preston would be unable to silence them through legal maneuvering or hired thugs. Zachary felt profoundly out of place among the finely dressed gentlemen, despite the tailored suit Mrs. Crawford had insisted on providing. He maintained a watchful position near the drawing room doors, his eyes constantly scanning the assembled guests for any sign of threat. Delilah, however, moved through the crowd with natural grace, her altered appearance drawing curious glances but no immediate recognition. Mrs. Crawford had introduced her as a distant niece, Mrs. Williams, recently arrived from the West with her husband. The story provided cover while they waited for Preston to make his appearance. "He'll be here," Mrs. Crawford assured them between greeting guests. Edward never misses an opportunity to be seen with the right people. She was proven correct when, nearly an hour into the gathering, a stir at the entrance announced the arrival of Edward Preston. Zachary's first glimpse of the man who had caused such havoc in their lives was almost anticlimactic. A tall, distinguished gentleman in his 50s, silver at his temples lending him an air of authority as he greeted acquaintances with practiced charm. Zachary caught Delilah's eye across the room, giving an imperceptible nod. It was time. Mr. Harrington had arrived earlier, carrying a leather portfolio containing the damning evidence against Preston. Now he moved to stand beside Mrs. Crawford, who nodded to the small chamber orchestra. The music ceased, drawing attention to their hostess. "Friends," Mrs. Crawford announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "Before we continue with our musical program, I have a matter of some importance to bring to your attention." Preston, who had been conversing with a group of bankers near the window, turned with a polite but puzzled expression. It froze into shock as Delilah stepped forward, her altered appearance insufficient to disguise her identity at such close range. "Mr. Preston," she said clearly, "I believe you've been looking for me." The murmuring that swept through the assembly was immediate. Preston recovered quickly, his face arranging itself into a mask of concern. "Delilah Jenkins," he exclaimed, taking a step forward. "My dear girl, we've been so worried." "Your mother is aware of what you did to my father," Delilah interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "As are many others now." Preston's gaze darted around the room, taking in Mr. Harrington with his ominous portfolio, Mrs. Crawford's steely expression, and finally settling on Zachary, who had moved to stand protectively at Delilah's side. "I see my concerns were justified," Preston said smoothly, regaining his composure. "You've clearly been influenced by this individual who abducted you." He addressed the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disturbance. Miss Jenkins has been through a terrible ordeal. She's not herself." "On the contrary," Mr. Harrington interjected, stepping forward. "Mrs. Whitman is entirely herself, a woman of remarkable courage and clarity. And she has evidence that you, Edward, systematically destroyed her father's business through fraud and manipulation." The ripple of shock that passed through the assembly was palpable. Preston's face hardened, his genial mask slipping. "Preposterous," he snapped. "Jenkins was a poor businessman who made bad investments. I merely acquired his debts at market value." After arranging for those debts to be called simultaneously, Harrington countered, opening his portfolio to extract several documents. "After placing one of your employees in his company to report on his financial movements. After spreading rumors among his creditors." Each accusation was accompanied by evidence, letters, bank records, sworn statements from former employees, passed among the assembled guests. Preston's expression grew increasingly stony as he watched Boston's elite examine proof of his duplicity. "This is absurd," he finally said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "A fabrication by a vindictive girl and her accomplice." It was Zachary who spoke then, his voice quiet but carrying. "Mr. Preston, we have no interest in vengeance. Only justice. Drop the false charges against my wife. Acknowledge your role in her father's ruin, and we'll consider the matter closed. Preston's laugh was brittle. You think it's that simple, Cowboy? You think these people, he gestured contemptuously at the assembled guests, care about your frontier notions of justice? This is Boston. We operate differently here. Do we, Edward? The new voice came from an elderly gentleman who had been examining the documents with particular attention. Do we condone fraud and intimidation in the name of business? I think not. Zachary recognized the speaker as Judge Wilson, whose name had appeared on several of the legal documents they had gathered. His intervention shifted the atmosphere in the room decisively. The evidence appears quite compelling, Judge Wilson continued, addressing the room rather than Preston directly. Compelling enough, I would say, to warrant a formal investigation by the district attorney's office. Preston's face drained of color as he realized the tide had turned against him. His gaze settled on Delilah with naked hatred. You'll regret this, he said softly. Both of you. It was Mrs. Crawford who answered, stepping forward with regal displeasure. No, Edward, it is you who will regret threatening a young couple in my home, before these witnesses. Your reputation in Boston is finished. I suggest you leave now, while you still can do so with a modicum of dignity. For a moment, it seemed Preston might lash out physically. Then, with visible effort, he mastered himself, straightening his jacket with trembling hands. This isn't over, he said, looking from Delilah to Zachary and back. Not by any means. With that final threat, he turned and strode from the room, the assembled guests parting to let him pass. A collective exhale followed his departure, then a buzz of conversation as Boston society digested the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. Judge Wilson approached them, his expression grave but not unkind. Mrs. Whitman, Mr. Whitman, I believe we have much to discuss. Perhaps somewhere more private. Over the next several hours, in Mrs. Crawford's study, the legal machinery that would clear their names was set in motion. Judge Wilson arranged for the false charges against Delilah to be dismissed and initiated proceedings against Preston for fraud and business misconduct. Mr. Harrington began the process of recovering what could be salvaged of Jenkins' imports. By evening, word had spread throughout Boston's upper circles. Edward Preston had left the city abruptly, taking only what could be packed in haste. Whether he fled to avoid legal consequences or social ostracism was unclear, but his departure marked the end of his threat to Delilah and Zachary. It's over, Delilah whispered that night as they stood on the balcony of Mrs. Crawford's townhouse, looking out over Boston's twinkling lights. Really over. Zachary's arm tightened around her waist. He's finished in Boston, at least. His type usually lands on their feet somewhere, but he won't have the power to hurt you again. To hurt us, she corrected gently. We faced him together. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. Together. They remained silent for a time, savoring the peace that had been so long in coming. Finally, Zachary voiced the question that had been building since Preston's departure. What happens now? Your father's business might be recoverable. You could stay in Boston, rebuild what was lost. Delilah turned in his arms, studying his face in the soft light from the windows. She saw the question beneath the question, the lingering doubt about whether she would choose her former life now that the danger had passed. Mr. Harrington can oversee the business matters, she said firmly. My place is with you. Unless. She hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. Unless you'd prefer to return to Montana alone. The very suggestion made his heart constrict. Delilah, nothing in this world could make me want to return without you. I know what you gave up, fleeing west. Your home, your society, your position. Now that it could be restored. She silenced him with a kiss, pouring into it all the certainty she felt about their shared future. When they parted, her eyes held his with unwavering conviction. My home isn't a place, Zachary. It's you. It's the life we've started building together. The cabin on the mountainside, the garden I planted, Tempest finally letting me ride him. Her smile was radiant with certainty. Boston was my past. You are my future. In her words, Zachary heard the echo of his own transformation, from the solitary man who believed safety lay in isolation to one who had discovered that true strength came from connection, from love freely given and returned. Then let's go home, he said simply, and in those words was a promise of all the years to come. Montana Territory, 1880. Autumn painted the mountainsides in brilliant hues of gold and crimson as Zachary Whitman stood on the porch of his expanded cabin, watching his wife move among the garden beds they had enlarged over the summer. Her golden hair, grown out again from its wartime cutting, caught the late afternoon sun as she harvested the last of the season's vegetables. The ranch had prospered in the years since their return from Boston. With a portion of the recovered Jenkins estate, they had purchased additional acreage, expanded their herd, and hired 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse Zachary had built near the corral. The cabin itself had grown to include a proper kitchen and a small room that would soon be needed for the child Delilah carried. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up from her work and smiled, that radiant expression that never failed to remind him how fortunate he was. He crossed the yard to join her, taking the basket of vegetables from her hands. "You're supposed to be resting," he chided gently, his free hand moving instinctively to the gentle swell of her abdomen. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she replied with the stubborn independence he had come to cherish. "Besides, I wanted to finish before the frost comes tonight." He conceded the point with a smile, helping her gather the remaining harvest. As they worked side by side in the golden light, Zachary reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from her desperate flight through the forest to their triumphant return from Boston, from marriage of convenience to the deep partnership they now shared. The threats that had brought them together had long since passed. Preston had fled to Europe, his reputation in America irreparably damaged. Delilah's mother, confronted with evidence of her would-be son-in-law's duplicity, had eventually reconciled with her daughter through a cautious exchange of letters. Though she remained in Boston, there was talk of her visiting when the baby arrived in the spring. Most importantly, the false belief that had shaped Zachary's life for so long, that connection meant vulnerability, that isolation was the only path to safety, had been thoroughly disproven by the woman who now stood beside him, soil on her hands and love in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Delilah asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "That you were meant for another man," he answered honestly. "At least, that's what the world thought. Your mother, Preston, society, they all had plans for you that didn't include a Montana rancher." She set down her trowel, rising to face him fully. "The world was wrong. I was meant for exactly the man I found." Her hand rose to touch his cheek, a gesture of tenderness that still had the power to humble him. "The one who saw me not as property to be claimed, but as a person to be cherished. Who taught me that true strength lies not in position or wealth, but in the courage to build something real together." He covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss against her palm. "I thought I needed solitude to survive. You showed me I needed love to truly live." As the sun dipped toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had made their own, Zachary Whitman drew his wife into his arms. The journey that had begun with her desperate flight through the forest had led them here, to a home built on trust, to a love forged through adversity, to a future bright with promise. Together, they had transformed a marriage of convenience into something far more powerful, a union of choice, of respect, of enduring love. And in that transformation, they had each found what they truly needed, not safety through isolation, but strength through connection. As twilight gathered around them, Zachary and Delilah Whitman turned toward their home, hand in hand, the harvest of their shared labor carried between them, a fitting metaphor for the life they had built and would continue to nurture in the years to come.